We're seeing you and other companies pulling back from the UK. Just last week saw that you were pausing one of your investments there. So what's happening in the UK, and should that send a message to policymakers here in the US?
Probably it should. I mean, I think the UK has been on a long, slow glide path from a leader in biopharmaceuticals to really a laggard. And that's happened over the last 20 years through a number of policy mistakes. The most important one is that their market is really unattractive for us. And it's become more unattractive every year. So in the context of a global competition for resources, global competition for investments, they rate pretty poorly. And that's despite, I think, a strong academic scientific base there. There's two pretty big companies in our industry there and many startups. But they're struggling, and our advocacy with the UK has been, look, if you can improve the environment, if you become a leader in intellectual property and regulatory systems, science on the ground is good, we can invest more. And we had been in talks to do that, particularly around one of our gateway labs. Recently, we've paused those, waiting for a policy response from the new administration there. They're in, active discussions with the U.S. on a trade deal that may shake loose some improvements there. We'll see. But until we see, the situation on the ground change in the UK, it's pretty hard to consider investing there. And I think that is a message to our country or any other that, capital goes to where it's wanted, where there's benefits to invest. And right now, that's not really the UK.
And as, for an American audience who maybe isn't familiar with everything that's happening in terms of pharmaceutical policy in the UK, what are some of the things that you would highlight to them, as those policies that you said put it on the glide path toward a, decline?
Well, the two big ones are they have a system by which they price new products, they value them, and they compare that. It's rational in a way. They compare it to the value of the alternatives if you don't get the medicine. And then they place a value on, okay, the medicine's producing relative value to those other alternatives. But unfortunately, the way they do that math, they peg that value to a number in 1997, and they haven't changed it since. So although healthcare inflation in the UK is 4 or 5% a year, the value consideration for medicine hasn't moved in almost 30 years. So that's, debased the value by all that inflation. It's almost a factor of 2.5 since 1997. So that's a big problem, and they've let that continue in the name of reducing budget expense, et cetera. UK spends half per capita on a GDP adjusted basis as the US on medicines, and we don't think that's right. And if all they do is change that new medicine calculation, they'll catch up. The other thing they do is at the end of the year, if they have a budget overrun in healthcare or in medicines, they just tax the industry back the difference. And so we end up, backstopping the risk of the government for using innovative medicines, and we don't care for that either. Last year, that tax was 23% of sales. That's like 100% income tax. So that's a terrible policy to attract investment, and we've been clear about that. They need to remove that tax, and they need to kind of get in the game on valuing new medicines by upgrading the value basis from 1997 to 2026.
And that brings up an interesting point, because obviously here in the U.S. we've been talking a lot about most favored nations and trying to raise drug prices in the U.S. lower them in the U.S. and raise them in other countries. But how much can you really raise them in other countries, particularly Europe, where they have these mechanisms specifically aimed at keeping prices low?
Yeah, they do. They've mastered the art of keeping prices low, and it's a one-sided equation. Companies simply have to submit into their system, and the system produces an answer. In some countries, that's a math-based answer, like the UK, and we can advocate for how to get better math. In other systems, it's more subjective, and I don't know how to change that. I think it's difficult, to be honest, and this is why we need the U.S. government and the U.S. Trade Relation Ambassador, as well as Department of Commerce and everyone else, to help us. Most medicines, 70% of the global new medicines, are invented in the United States. The IP is created here with our scientists. And a growing percent, as with the announcement here today in Virginia, will be made in the U.S. and exported. But if we don't have a market overseas, I think that's a major problem. I think the administration has talked about the goals of their pricing policy is to increase the pricing in developed countries and lower it in the U.S. And conceptually, we're for that, but we need to see the facts on the ground change in Europe. So far, they haven't. And the UK is a prime example of that.
And even, you took the price increase on Mounjaro in the private market in the UK. I mean, how much will that actually have an impact on you as Lilly?
Well, we expect, of course, we'll get more price per unit and we'll have fewer units. Now, it's a little bit of a unique situation because Mounjaro is basically unreimbursed. It's an out-of-pocket market. And what we've just been talking about in the UK is the reimbursed part. We would love it for the UK to reimburse Mounjaro for obesity. I think that could change the trajectory of health costs in their country, maybe more than anything else they could consider. But this is all part of the problem, that expensive new medicines don't get listed, or they wait out 3, 4, sometimes 5 years, and then your patent is nearly expired. So these are the kinds of things we need help from our government to change. So, in the US, we launch a new product, it's available the next day. That's not the case in Europe. And that kind of pressure on companies is one of the reasons why people concede to lower prices, along with those government-driven systems I spoke about.